Socrates is usually presented as the beginning of serious philosophy, the figure who taught people to question everything, to examine their beliefs, to refuse easy answers. His method feels powerful because it exposes weakness. Someone claims to know something, and through careful questioning, that certainty begins to collapse. Definitions break down, assumptions contradict each other, confidence turns into hesitation. It creates the impression that real intelligence lies in dismantling what appears obvious. At first, this feels like progress, because it frees you from false certainty. It shows you how easily people believe things they have never properly examined. It reveals how language can hide confusion behind familiar words. Justice, virtue, knowledge, all of these terms seem clear until you are forced to define them precisely, and then they begin to dissolve. Socrates makes you aware of that gap, and that awareness feels like a step toward truth. But something important happens if you stay in that method long enough. The focus remains on questioning, but it never fully arrives at an answer that can hold. Each definition leads to another problem. Each attempt at clarity reveals a deeper ambiguity. The process continues, but the destination remains unclear. You become better at identifying what is wrong, but not necessarily better at establishing what is right. This is where the method begins to feel incomplete, because removing false beliefs is only part of the task. At some point, you need something to stand on. You need a way to act, to decide, to move forward without constantly dissolving your own conclusions. But Socratic questioning, by its nature, resists that kind of finality. It treats certainty with suspicion, and in doing so, it makes stable conclusions difficult to maintain. This creates a tension between clarity and action. The more rigorously you question your beliefs, the harder it becomes to hold them with confidence. You see the weaknesses in your own reasoning. You anticipate objections before they are raised. You recognize that any position you take can be challenged, refined, or dismantled. And while that makes your thinking more careful, it can also make your decisions more hesitant. You're always aware of what you might be missing. That awareness does not disappear once you leave the conversation. It follows you into real situations. You try to decide what is right, but you can see multiple sides. You try to find what matters, but each definition feels incomplete. You try to justify your choice, but you can already see how it could be questioned. This is where the method starts to affect how you live. Because real decisions do not wait for perfect clarity. They happen under uncertainty, with limited information, with competing values that cannot be fully resolved. In those moments, the ability to question everything is not always helpful. It can slow you down, fragment your focus, and leave you circling the problem instead of moving through it. Socratic thinking sharpens your awareness of complexity, but it does not always give you a way to handle it. The method is designed to expose confusion, not to replace it with a stable structure. It assumes that by clearing away false beliefs, something more solid will eventually emerge. But that emergence is not guaranteed. You can remove layer after layer of assumption and still find yourself without a clear foundation. This is where the idea that Socrates leads nowhere begins to take shape. Not because the method is useless, but because it is incomplete when taken on its own. It is excellent at breaking down illusions, but it does not always build something in their place. It creates intellectual movement without necessarily creating direction. And without direction, movement can become circular. You return to the same questions in slightly different forms. You refine your understanding, but you do not settle it. You become more precise in identifying problems, but less certain about solutions. The process continues, but it does not converge in a way that clearly guides action. There's also a deeper issue in how the method relates to knowledge itself. Socrates often emphasizes that he knows nothing, that wisdom begins with recognizing one's own ignorance. This can be a powerful corrective to arrogance. It keeps you open, prevents premature certainty, and encourages ongoing inquiry. But if taken too far, it can undermine the possibility of knowledge in a practical sense. Because if every claim is subject to continuous doubt, and every definition can be dismantled, then the idea of knowing something in a stable way becomes difficult to sustain. You're always one step away from questioning your own conclusions again. This creates a kind of intellectual instability. Not dramatic, but persistent. You are engaged in thinking, but never fully settled in what you think. You are always refining, always reconsidering, always aware that what you hold now may not withstand further examination. And while that keeps you from being rigid, it can also keep you from being decisive. This is the point where the method begins to conflict with the demands of life. Because living requires commitment. It requires acting on beliefs that are not perfectly certain, choosing between options that are not fully resolved, holding positions that could, in principle, be challenged. If you wait until all doubt is removed, you will not act at all. Socratic questioning does not resolve that tension. It intensifies it. It shows you why certainty is difficult, but it does not tell you how to move forward without it. And in doing so, it can leave you in a position where you understand the limits of knowledge more clearly than the content of knowledge itself. That is where it begins to feel like it leads nowhere. Not because it fails to reveal problems, but because it does not fully address what comes after those problems are revealed. Once you internalize the Socratic method, it does not stay confined to conversations. It becomes a habit of mind. You begin to apply the same pattern of questioning to your own thoughts, your own beliefs, your own decisions. On the surface, this looks like intellectual discipline. You're no longer satisfied with vague answers. You push for clarity, for consistency, for definitions that can withstand scrutiny. But the deeper effect is that your thinking becomes recursive. It turns back on itself. You do not just ask what you believe. You ask why you believe it. Then you question the reason you just gave. Then you examine the assumptions behind that reason. Each layer opens another, and there is no clear point where the process naturally stops. The method encourages continuation, not closure. And because of that, it gradually shifts your relationship to certainty itself. Certainty begins to feel suspicious, not because it is always wrong, but because you can now see how easily it can be challenged. Any position you take can be reframed, redefined, or broken down into smaller claims that are less stable than they first appeared. You become aware that your conclusions depend on premises, and those premises can be questioned in the same way. This creates a chain that does not terminate cleanly. There is always another step back you can take. At an intellectual level, this is valuable. It prevents dogmatism. It forces you to recognize the limits of your own understanding. It keeps your thinking flexible. But when this mode of thinking becomes dominant, it begins to interfere with something else, which is the ability to settle on a position long enough to act on it. Because action requires a temporary stopping point. You cannot question indefinitely and still move forward. At some point, you have to treat a belief as sufficiently stable, even if it is not perfectly secure. You have to accept the definition, even if it could be refined further. You have to commit to a course of action, even if alternative interpretations remain possible. Socratic questioning does not naturally provide that stopping point. It leaves the door open at every stage. This is where the method begins to create friction in practical reasoning. You approach decisions with the same level of scrutiny you apply to abstract questions. You analyze options, examine assumptions, anticipate objections. But instead of clarifying the decision, this can multiply its complexity. Each option branches into further considerations. Each justification reveals potential weaknesses. And instead of narrowing the field, the process can expand it. You become more aware, but less decisive. Not because you lack intelligence, but because your intelligence is being directed toward continuous examination rather than resolution. You see too many angles at once. You recognize too many variables. And without a framework that prioritizes or limits this analysis, it becomes difficult to determine when you have thought enough. This is where overanalysis begins to take hold. It does not feel like overthinking because it is structured and deliberate. It feels like you're doing exactly what you should be doing, which is examining your reasoning carefully. But the result is similar. You delay action. You revisit the same questions. You refine your understanding without necessarily moving closer to a decision. At the same time, The method changes how you relate to disagreement. Instead of treating opposing views as simply different, you are trained to interrogate them. You look for inconsistencies, hidden assumptions, unclear definitions. This can lead to more productive discussions, but it can also make it difficult to recognize when a position is good enough rather than perfectly defensible. You continue to probe, to question, to refine, even when further analysis no longer adds meaningful clarity. This has a subtle consequence. It raises the standard for what counts as an acceptable answer, not in a formal sense, but in your own thinking. You begin to expect a level of precision and coherence that is difficult to achieve in many real situations. And when that standard is not met, which is often the case, you hesitate to fully accept the conclusion. You keep it provisional, open to revision, subject to further questioning. That provisional stance has value in theory, but in practice, it can weaken commitment. You hold your beliefs lightly, which prevents rigidity, but also reduces the force with which you act on them. You remain open, but also somewhat detached. You are engaged in thinking, but not always anchored in a decision. This creates a kind of intellectual posture that is alert and critical, but not always effective in situations that require clear direction. There is also a structural limitation in the method itself. Socratic questioning is designed to expose contradictions and clarify concepts, but it does not provide criteria for choosing between multiple coherent positions. Two different interpretations can both survive scrutiny, both avoid contradiction, and yet lead to different conclusions. The method can reveal problems within each, but it does not necessarily tell you which one to adopt. So you're left comparing positions that are each defensible in their own way. And without an external standard or a practical constraint, the comparison can continue indefinitely. You weigh arguments, consider implications, test consistency, but the process does not naturally converge on a single answer. It refines your understanding of the options without necessarily selecting one. This is where the method begins to feel like it is circling rather than progressing. It deepens analysis, but does not always produce resolution. And over time, that pattern shapes how you approach not just philosophical questions, but everyday decisions. You become skilled at examining, but less practiced at concluding. You're comfortable with ambiguity, but less comfortable with commitment. You understand the limits of certainty, but are left without a clear strategy for acting within those limits. This is the point where the strength of the method starts to turn into a constraint. It sharpens your thinking, but it also extends it beyond the point where it remains useful for action. And because the method does not include a built-in way to stop, the responsibility for ending the process falls entirely on you. At this point, the limitation is no longer subtle. It becomes structural. The Socratic method is exceptionally good at opening questions, but it has no equally strong mechanism for closing them. It assumes, often implicitly, that clarity will emerge if confusion is removed, that once contradictions are exposed and definitions refined, something stable will remain. But in many cases, what remains is not a clear answer, but a more precise understanding of why clear answers are difficult. That creates a gap between insight and direction. You understand more about the problem, but you are not necessarily closer to resolving it. You see the weaknesses in different positions, but that does not automatically tell you which position to adopt. And because the method encourages you to keep questioning, you can always reopen what you have already examined. There is no internal point at which the process declares itself complete. This matters because real life does not wait for completion. Decisions have to be made under conditions that are not fully resolved. You act with partial information, with competing considerations that cannot be perfectly aligned, with reasons that are sufficient but not final. A method that continually destabilizes your reasons without providing a way to stabilize them again will leave you intellectually active but practically suspended. This is where the sense that it leads nowhere becomes more precise. It does not lead nowhere in the sense of producing nothing. It produces insight, clarity about confusion, awareness of limits. But it does not reliably lead to a point where you can say, this is what I will do, and this is why, in a way that feels settled enough to support action. It keeps the space of reasons open, but does not narrow it in a way that guides commitment. To function in practice, something has to interrupt that openness. You have to decide that further questioning will not meaningfully change the outcome, that a position is good enough even if it is not immune to critique, that action cannot be delayed until every objection is answered. This is not a failure of reasoning. It is a different requirement altogether. It is the recognition that reasoning operates within limits, and that those limits have to be acknowledged rather than continuously pushed back. The Socratic method does not supply that recognition on its own. It treats continued inquiry as a virtue, and in many contexts it is. But when that orientation becomes dominant, it can prevent the formation of stable commitments. You remain in a state of examination, but do not transition into a state of resolution. You understand the terrain, but do not choose a path through it. This is where a more complete picture of thinking has to be introduced. Questioning is one phase, not the entire process. It serves to test, to refine, to expose weaknesses. But it has to be followed by a phase that selects, prioritizes, and commits. That phase cannot be derived from questioning alone, because it involves criteria that are not purely logical. It involves judgment about relevance, about sufficiency, about what matters in a given situation. It involves accepting that some degree of uncertainty is unavoidable. Without that second phase, the first becomes self-extending. It continues to operate because nothing within it tells it to stop. And the more skilled you become at questioning, the easier it is to keep the process going. You can always find another angle, another distinction, another assumption to examine. The method sustains itself, but the movement it creates is not directional. It expands the field rather than narrowing it. This is why it can feel like intellectual motion without practical arrival. You're not stuck in the sense of being inactive. You're actively thinking, analyzing, engaging. But that activity does not converge on a decision in a way that supports action. It refines possibilities without selecting among them. It keeps options open, but does not close them. At some point, that has to be corrected, not by abandoning questioning, but by placing it within a broader structure. You question in order to improve your reasons, not to indefinitely suspend them. You refine your beliefs to the point where they're stable enough to act on, not perfectly immune to critique. You accept that any decision you make will remain open to future revision, and that this does not invalidate the decision at the moment it is made. This introduces a different standard, not certainty, but adequacy, not finality, but sufficiency. You move from asking whether a belief can be doubted to asking whether further doubt is relevant to the decision you face. That shift does not eliminate uncertainty, but contains it. It prevents the process of questioning from expanding beyond its useful role. In that context, the Socratic method regains its value. It becomes a tool for sharpening thought rather than a condition that dominates it. It helps you avoid weak reasoning without preventing you from forming conclusions. It remains critical, but not paralyzing. It contributes to clarity, but does not replace the need for commitment. The problem arises only when it is treated as the whole of philosophy rather than one part of it. Because on its own, it cannot carry you from confusion to action. It can take you from false certainty to informed uncertainty, but it cannot complete the transition from uncertainty to decision. That final step requires something the method does not provide, which is the willingness to stop questioning at a point that is justified but not absolute. And without that step, the process continues. Insight deepens, but direction does not. Understanding expands, but movement stalls. And that is the precise sense in which it leads nowhere.